You've been lied to, not by a criminal, not by a politician, by a television show that took one of the most extraordinary true stories in American history and made it less incredible than it actually was. You watched Boardwalk Empire. You saw Steve Buscemi play Nucky Johnson, the smooth, carnation-wearing, whiskey-dealing boss of Atlantic City. You watched the parties, the murders, the betrayals, the glamour, and you thought you understood the Prohibition era. You thought you understood the man. You didn't, because the real man, Enoch Lewis Johnson, was wealthier than the show dared to show, more untouchable than any fictional character could be, more politically dangerous than Al Capone ever was. And his true story, the actual documented, researched, jaw-dropping truth of how one man owned an entire American city for 3 decades, is so wild, so dark, and so deeply American, that if a writer pitched it as fiction today, they'd be laughed out of the room for making it too unbelievable. Before we go any further, pause for just 1 second. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching this from? What country, what city? And what time is it there right now? I genuinely want to know who's in this community. People watch these videos from every corner of the world, and I find that incredible. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now. We tell real stories that Hollywood couldn't make up even if it tried. Hit the like button if you're already locked in. And share this with one person, just one, who thinks they know everything about the mob era. Because after today, they'll realize they knew almost nothing. Now, let's go back to Atlantic City. January 20th, 1883. That's the day Enoch Lewis Johnson was born in Smithville, New Jersey. Not Atlantic City. Not some glamorous resort town or wealthy suburb. Smithville. A tiny, quiet, almost forgotten settlement in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. A region so wild and so isolated that locals called it simply the Barrens. It was the kind of place where opportunity didn't knock, because opportunity didn't know the address. His father's name was Smith Johnson. And here is where the story of Nucky Johnson begins to reveal its deepest truth, because Smith Johnson was not just any man in Atlantic County. He was the sheriff, the actual law, the man with the badge, the authority, and the relationships that kept the county functioning. Growing up as the sheriff's son in a small, politically connected New Jersey county in the 1880s was not like growing up anywhere else in America. It was an education, not in textbooks, not in classrooms, in power. Young Enoch watched his father every single day. He watched how people talked to him differently than they talked to other men. He watched how favors were exchanged. Not with money, not always, but with loyalty, with votes, with silence. He watched how a man with a badge and a title could make things happen or make things stop simply by making a phone call or having a conversation. He was absorbing everything, filing it all away, building a mental library of how power actually worked in the real world. Not the version taught in civics class, but the version that actually operated in courtrooms and back rooms and sheriff's offices across America. The Johnson family was not wealthy. Let that be absolutely clear, because it matters enormously to this story. Nucky Johnson did not inherit money. He did not come from a powerful family in the traditional sense. He came from a family that understood the machinery of local government, and that understanding was worth more than any inheritance. It was a different kind of capital. Invisible capital. The kind you can't put in a bank but can spend everywhere. Atlantic City itself, during Nucky's childhood, was not the glittering resort town it would become. In the 1880s, it was still finding its identity. The famous boardwalk had only been constructed in 1870, barely a decade before Nucky was born. The city was raw, ambitious, full of people trying to figure out what it wanted to be. Hotels were going up. Tourists were starting to come from Philadelphia and New York, just a short train ride away. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly to the east, and the city's leaders understood something important. People would pay enormous amounts of money to sit near that ocean, eat good food, drink good drinks, and forget their ordinary lives for a few days. That fundamental insight would shape everything, including Nucky Johnson's entire career. As a teenager, Nucky began working in the county system. Not dramatically, not with any fanfare. He started as a clerk, a simple, unremarkable administrative position that most people would have seen as a dead end, a boring government job with no future. But Nucky Johnson did not see it that way. He saw every piece of paper that crossed his desk as information. Every name, every transaction, every permit, every complaint, every contract. All of it was data. He was building a map of Atlantic County in his mind. He was learning who owned what, who owed whom, which businesses depended on which licenses, and, most importantly, who actually had power versus who merely appeared to have it. His father eventually made him undersheriff. This was significant not because of the title but because of the access it provided. As undersheriff, young Nucky Johnson had a legitimate reason to be everywhere, to talk to everyone, to understand every corner of the county's operation. He was present at moments that mattered. He was in rooms where decisions were being made. And he was smart enough to understand that being present and being remembered by the right people was the foundation of everything that would come next. There is something critical to understand about the young Nucky Johnson that the television show almost entirely skipped. He was not ambitious in the flashy, obvious way. He was not the loudest person in the room. He was not making dramatic declarations about wanting power. He was patient, quietly, systematically patient. He watched. He listened. He built relationships one at a time, carefully, genuinely. He understood that real power, the durable kind, the kind that survives elections and scandals and changing times, is built person by person, favor by favor, over years and decades. Not overnight. Never overnight. His early life also taught him something that very few people in his generation understood: the difference between formal power and real power. Formal power is a title, a badge, an office. Real power is what happens when people do what you want them to do, not because they have to, but because they want to, because they owe you, because they're afraid of losing your support, because you've been good to them and they expect to need your goodness again. Nucky Johnson learned this distinction before he was 30 years old, and it would become the operating system of his entire empire. He saw his first major mentor fall, and he learned from that too. Louis Kunnel, known as the Commodore, was the original political boss of Atlantic City. A large, commanding, physically imposing man who had built the Republican political machine that controlled Atlantic County with an iron grip. Kunnel was everything a political boss was supposed to be in that era. Connected, generous to friends, ruthless to enemies, and seemingly untouchable. He ran the Republican Party of Atlantic County the way a CEO runs a company, with total authority over hiring, contracts, and strategy. And for years, he appeared invincible. Then in 1911, a reform-minded Democratic governor named Woodrow Wilson, yes, the same man who would later become President of the United States, made it his personal mission to break up the Atlantic County machine. Investigators descended on Atlantic City. Witnesses talked. Evidence emerged. And Louis Kunnel, the seemingly untouchable Commodore, was convicted of corruption charges and sent to prison. His empire, built over decades, collapsed in months. This moment shaped Nucky Johnson more profoundly than almost anything else in his life. He watched the Commodore fall, and he did not grieve. He studied it. He asked himself one devastating question: what did Kunnel do wrong? And then he spent the rest of his life making sure he never made the same mistakes. Kunnel's error, as Nucky saw it, was visibility. Kunnel had been too obvious, too direct, too openly corrupt in ways that left paper trails and created enemies. Nucky decided he would be different. He would be the man behind the curtain, technically legitimate, always holding a title that had a real legal basis, always maintaining the fiction of public service while quietly directing an operation of breathtaking scope and complexity. When Kunnel went to prison, a vacuum opened at the center of Atlantic County politics. And Nucky Johnson, calm, prepared, patient, and completely ready, stepped directly into it. To understand Nucky Johnson, you have to understand Atlantic City. Not the Atlantic City of today, the faded, casino-dotted, slightly melancholy shore town that it became in the late 20th century. The Atlantic City of the early 1900s was something else entirely. It was extraordinary. It was excessive. It was the most visited tourist destination in America and possibly the world for a period of time, pulling millions of visitors every single year from Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and beyond. People came to Atlantic City for one reason: to escape. To escape their lives, their jobs, their marriages, their sobriety, their morality, and their ordinary selves. The ocean was beautiful, yes. The boardwalk was famous and genuinely spectacular. But what really drew people, what made Atlantic City magnetic in a way that other beach towns simply weren't, was that in Atlantic City the rules were different. Or rather, the rules were the same on paper, but nobody enforced them. And everybody knew it. Gambling was illegal in New Jersey. It happened openly in Atlantic City. Prostitution was illegal. It thrived on the line, a specific stretch of streets in Atlantic City where brothels operated publicly, with police walking past them every hour of every day and seeing nothing. Alcohol had restrictions. Those restrictions did not apply in Atlantic City, where saloons served 24 hours a day and nobody asked questions. There was an unspoken agreement between the city's leadership and its visitors. Come here, spend your money, enjoy yourself, and we promise not to trouble you with the law. This was not an accident. It was a business model. The economy of Atlantic City depended entirely on the idea that it was a place apart from the normal world. Hotels needed guests. Restaurants needed customers. The boardwalk merchants needed foot traffic. And all of them, every single business in that city, understood that if Atlantic City suddenly became a place where laws were actually enforced, the tourists would stop coming and the entire economy would collapse. The corruption wasn't a bug in the system. It was the feature that made the system work. This created something politically unique in American history. Every single person with a financial stake in Atlantic City had a direct personal interest in maintaining the existing corrupt arrangement. Hotel owners, restaurant owners, cab drivers, boarding house operators, shop owners, entertainers. They all needed the machine to keep running because the machine kept their businesses alive. This meant that when Nucky Johnson eventually took control of that machine, he wasn't just collecting political support from people who liked him or owed him favors. He was the protector of the entire local economy. Opposing Nucky Johnson meant risking your livelihood. Supporting him meant your business stayed open and your problems went away. You cannot overstate how powerful that position is. The city's geography also mattered enormously. Atlantic City sits on a barrier island, Absecon Island, connected to the mainland by a series of bridges and causeways. This physical isolation gave it a psychological identity separate from the rest of New Jersey. It was an island in every sense, geographically, culturally, and legally. What happened in Atlantic City felt contained, separate, almost exempt from the normal rules that govern the mainland. Even federal authorities in those early decades of the 20th century had limited reach. The city's law enforcement was entirely local, entirely under the control of the county political machine, and entirely loyal to whoever ran that machine. The political structure that Nucky inherited and expanded was built on the Republican Party of Atlantic County. Now, in the 21st century, the words Republican Party carry specific connotations. But in New Jersey in the early 1900s, political party labels were almost beside the point. The Republican Party of Atlantic County was not a political ideology. It was an organization, a machine, a business. Its purpose was not to implement any particular governing philosophy. It was to maintain power, distribute patronage, and keep the organization's leaders profitable and protected. Democrats in Atlantic City at that time were simply the opposition, people who wanted access to the machine's resources but didn't have it. Nucky Johnson would eventually build his power base so thoroughly within the Republican structure that he personally decided who ran for almost every elected office in Atlantic County. Sheriff, prosecutor, judges, city council, state assembly. He didn't just influence elections. He chose candidates the way a casting director chooses actors. He selected people who were capable enough to do the job without embarrassing him and loyal enough to never act against his interests. He created a system where every elected official in Atlantic County owed their career to Nucky Johnson, which meant that every law enforcement officer, every judge, every prosecutor, every government administrator in the county was, in the most practical sense, working for him. Think about what that actually means for a moment. It means Nucky Johnson couldn't be arrested. Not because the law didn't apply to him on paper, but because the people who would have had to arrest him, prosecute him, and judge him were all people whose careers he controlled. It was the most elegant protection scheme in American history, and it required no violence whatsoever to maintain. Just votes, just patronage, just the careful, consistent management of political relationships over decades. The city also had a racial dynamic that was complex and essential to understanding how power actually worked. Atlantic City had a significant African American population, workers in the hotels, restaurants, and service industries that kept the resort town running. These communities had their own political structures, their own leaders, their own networks. And Nucky Johnson, unlike many white political bosses of his era, understood that ignoring these communities was a strategic mistake. He made deliberate, calculated alliances with black political leaders in Atlantic City, delivering real benefits, jobs, protection, political representation within the machine, in exchange for votes and loyalty. This was not altruism. It was math. Nucky Johnson needed votes to control elections, and every voting block mattered. He was one of the few political bosses in the Northeast who built genuine working relationships with black community leaders at a time when most white political structures either ignored or actively suppressed black political participation. These relationships would prove surprisingly durable and would be part of the foundation of his organization for decades. The city was also deeply tied to the broader criminal networks that operated along the entire East Coast. Atlantic City was not just a tourist destination. It was a waypoint, a distribution hub, and a meeting place for criminal enterprises from New York to Baltimore. The port access, the political protection, the established culture of looking the other way, all of it made Atlantic City uniquely valuable to anyone who needed to move illegal goods, hold secret meetings, or operate businesses that couldn't exist anywhere else. By the time Nucky Johnson consolidated his power, Atlantic City was the East Coast's most important criminal headquarters, and Nucky was its landlord. In 1908, Enoch Lewis Johnson was appointed Atlantic County Treasurer. Read that title again. Atlantic County Treasurer. It sounds like the most boring job in local government. It conjures images of spreadsheets and budget meetings and men in gray suits arguing about municipal bond rates. It sounds like exactly the kind of position that ambitious people avoid because it offers no fame, no glamour, and no obvious path to anything interesting. It was, in fact, the most strategically brilliant position Nucky Johnson could possibly have chosen. And it was not an accident that he chose it. The county treasurer controlled the money. All of it. Every dollar that flowed through Atlantic County government, tax revenue, permits, licenses, contracts, fees, fines, passed through the treasurer's office. And whoever controlled the flow of money controlled everything downstream from it. Every road construction contract had to be approved through channels that the treasurer influenced. Every business license carried fees that went through his office. Every political campaign needed financial infrastructure that he could provide or withhold. The treasurer's office was the financial nervous system of the entire county, and Nucky Johnson sat at its center for over 30 years. He held this position from 1908 until his federal conviction in 1941. 33 years. Through World War I, through Prohibition, through the Roaring Twenties, through the Great Depression, through the repeal of Prohibition, through the beginnings of World War II. Mayors came and went. Governors rose and fell. Presidents changed. Nucky Johnson remained, the treasurer of Atlantic County, the most dangerous accountant in American history. The system he built and operated has a technical name in political science, a patronage machine. But calling it that understates its complexity and its completeness. Nucky's organization was more sophisticated than most patronage systems of its era. It had multiple layers, multiple revenue streams, and multiple enforcement mechanisms, none of which required a single gunshot. The most visible layer was straightforward. If you wanted a government job in Atlantic County, you got it through the organization. Teachers, road workers, clerks, police officers, firefighters, every government employee in the county understood that their job existed because the machine allowed it to exist, and that their continued employment depended on their loyalty to the machine. This was not a secret. It was an open, understood arrangement. You voted as directed. You contributed a percentage of your government salary back to the organization at election time. You did not publicly support opposition candidates. In exchange, your job was secure, your family was taken care of, and you had access to the machine's considerable resources when you needed them. But government employees were only the beginning. Every business in Atlantic City that operated outside the boundaries of the law, every gambling operation, every brothel, every speakeasy, every numbers runner, every bookie, paid a regular tribute to the organization. Not as extortion exactly, as a fee for protection, for the guarantee that the police would not raid them, that the courts would not prosecute them, that they could operate openly and profitably in an environment that should have been hostile to their existence. The math was simple. Pay Nucky's organization, stay open and make money. Don't pay, get raided and shut down. Every illegal business operator in Atlantic City understood this calculation immediately. Then there was the layer of legitimate business. Construction companies that wanted county contracts knew they needed the organization's blessing. Suppliers who wanted to sell materials to the county understood the same thing. Lawyers who wanted cases steered their way. Doctors who wanted municipal contracts. Insurance brokers who wanted county business. All of them existed within Nucky's sphere of influence, and all of them understood, without being explicitly told, that their financial relationship with the county government depended on their relationship with the machine. This created a situation where Nucky Johnson's personal income was enormous, estimated by federal investigators at between $500,000 and $1 million per year at the peak of his operation, in 1920s dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that is between $8 million and $16 million per year in modern terms. From a man whose official salary as county treasurer was a few $1,000s annually. The genius of the system was its invisibility. None of the money came to Nucky directly. It flowed through layers of the organization, through associates, through the County Republican Party Committee, through various business arrangements that created enough distance between the cash and the treasurer's desk to make prosecution nearly impossible. Nucky Johnson was not Al Capone, who famously kept cash in safes and threw money around conspicuously. Nucky was careful, disciplined. He maintained enough plausible deniability around the mechanics of the operation that investigators struggled for decades to prove what everyone in Atlantic City already knew. He also had a political operation that was genuinely, remarkably effective at winning elections. Voter fraud in Atlantic City during the Nucky Johnson era was not subtle. Ballots were stuffed. Voters were paid. Dead men voted. Immigrants were given quick citizenship arrangements and marched to polling stations. Opposition candidates found that their poll watchers were mysteriously unavailable on Election Day. Nucky's people controlled the vote counting. The results of Atlantic County elections during his reign were, in many cases, simply whatever Nucky Johnson had decided they would be before a single real ballot was cast. This sounds extreme. It was. But it was also, in the context of American political machines of that era, not entirely unusual. The Tammany Hall machine in New York, the Hague machine in Jersey City, the Pendergast machine in Kansas City, all of them operated with similar methods. What made Atlantic City different was the combination of the machine's efficiency with the city's unique economic position as a resort town built on vice. Nucky had more money flowing through his operation than most machine bosses, which meant he could buy more loyalty, employ more people, and maintain a more comprehensive system of control. He also understood something that many political bosses missed. You had to give people a reason to be loyal beyond fear. Nucky Johnson was famous, genuinely, historically famous, for his personal generosity. He gave money to poor families in Atlantic City. He showed up at funerals. He remembered people's names and the names of their children. He helped people who needed a doctor or a lawyer or a job. He was, by all accounts of people who knew him, genuinely warm and personally charming in a way that no television show has fully captured. People didn't just work for Nucky because they feared the consequences of not working for him. Many of them genuinely liked him, genuinely felt loyal to him as a person, and that made his machine far more stable than one built purely on coercion. He maintained his most visible public presence through a very specific personal image. He dressed extraordinarily well, always impeccably turned out in expensive suits, with a trademark red carnation in his lapel, polished shoes, and the overall presentation of a man who took himself and his position with complete seriousness. He was called the Mayor of the Boardwalk, not an official title, but one that captured perfectly how Atlantic City residents saw him. Not as a criminal, as a leader, the real leader, not the elected officials who technically ran the city but whom everyone understood were Nucky's people. He lived not in a private home but in a permanent suite at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Atlantic City, arguably the finest hotel in the city, certainly the most expensive. He had his meals in restaurants, his laundry done professionally. His every need attended to by a hotel staff that understood exactly who was living in that suite. This was a deliberate choice. It said something about him. Said, "I am not hiding. I am not in a back room somewhere. I am right here, in the center of everything, in the best room in the best hotel, and I am not afraid of anyone." That kind of confidence, backed by 30 years of accumulated power, relationships, and protection, was its own form of authority. On January 17, 1920, the Volstead Act went into effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors was officially illegal across the United States of America. The great experiment of Prohibition had begun. For most Americans, this was either a moral triumph or a catastrophic inconvenience. For Enoch Lewis Johnson, it was the single greatest financial opportunity of his life. Before we go any further, understand something about Nucky Johnson and alcohol. He was not a prohibitionist. He had never been remotely sympathetic to the temperance movement. He had watched Atlantic City's resort economy run on liquor for his entire career. He had watched tourists arrive specifically to drink in places where drinking was tolerated. He had built a political machine that depended partly on the revenue generated by establishments that served alcohol. And he had absolutely no intention of letting a constitutional amendment interfere with any of that. What Prohibition actually did, from Nucky Johnson's perspective, was remove his competitors. Before Prohibition, the legal alcohol industry was run by legitimate businesses, breweries, distilleries, wine producers, bar owners, operating within the law, paying taxes, competing openly. These were businesses that Nucky could not easily control, because they were legal and therefore not dependent on his protection. The moment Prohibition made alcohol illegal, every single one of those legitimate businesses either closed or went underground. And going underground meant they needed exactly what Nucky Johnson had to offer: protection, distribution networks, political cover, and the guarantee that the police would look away. The liquor trade didn't stop when Prohibition began. It simply changed management. And the new management was men like Nucky Johnson. Atlantic City's geography was perfectly suited to bootlegging on a massive scale. The barrier island had ocean access. Ships could anchor offshore, beyond the 3-mile territorial limit, and be loaded with Canadian or European liquor. Small, fast boats could make the run from ship to shore in darkness, delivering load after load to the city's docks. From there, trucks would move the liquor through Atlantic City to distribution points that served New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and points inland. The entire operation required coordination, vehicles, boats, drivers, dockhands, warehouse space, and above all, protection from the law, which meant it required Nucky Johnson. He didn't personally run the liquor trade. He was far too smart and too careful for that. What he did was tax it. Every bootlegger who wanted to use Atlantic City as a distribution point paid a fee to the organization. Every speakeasy that operated within the city paid for protection. Every shipment that came through Atlantic County paid a percentage. The liquor flowed through Atlantic City like water, and Nucky Johnson stood at the point where every stream converged and collected his portion of every drop. His main operational partners in the bootlegging trade were the Rhinefield Syndicate, a sophisticated bootlegging operation that actually managed the mechanics of importing, storing, and distributing liquor. Joseph Rhinefield and his associates handled the actual criminal operations while Nucky provided the political infrastructure that made those operations safe. It was a perfect division of labor. The Rhinefield people were the expertise, and Nucky was the insurance policy. He also maintained relationships with bootleggers and criminal organizations throughout the Northeast. His connections extended to the biggest names of the era, and none of those connections was more significant or more fascinating than his relationship with Alphonse Gabriel Capone. Al Capone, the most famous gangster in American history, the man whose name became synonymous with organized crime, with Prohibition-era violence, with the Tommy gun and the expensive suit and the scarred face. By the mid-1920s, Capone was running Chicago's criminal empire with a combination of violence, bribery, and business acumen that had made him extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily wealthy. And he was a fan of Atlantic City. Capone came to Atlantic City regularly. He loved the resort, loved the beach, loved the freedom from Chicago's politics and enemies and responsibilities. And when Al Capone came to Atlantic City, he was Nucky Johnson's guest. Not in any formal, announced sense, but in the practical sense that Capone moved through Atlantic City with a level of comfort and safety that was only possible because the city's boss had extended his protection. Capone and Nucky had a genuine professional relationship, mutual respect between two men who understood power and operated at the highest level of their respective worlds. But the most extraordinary meeting of this entire era, one of the most extraordinary meetings in American criminal history, took place in Atlantic City in 1929. The Atlantic City Conference. In May of 1929, Enoch Lewis Johnson organized and hosted what amounted to a summit meeting of the most powerful criminal bosses in the United States. The venue was the President Hotel in Atlantic City. The attendees included Al Capone from Chicago, Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello from New York, Meyer Lansky, who was already building his reputation as organized crime's greatest financial mind, Mo Dalitz from Cleveland, King Solomon from Boston, Abe Bernstein from Detroit's Purple Gang, and representatives from criminal organizations in Philadelphia, New Orleans, Kansas City, and elsewhere. Think about that for a moment. Nucky Johnson brought these men together. He was the host, the organizer, the man whose city, whose protection, whose political infrastructure made it possible for the most powerful criminals in America to gather openly in a hotel, meet for days, eat together, walk the boardwalk together, and conduct business that would shape the structure of American organized crime for the next generation. The agenda of the Atlantic City Conference was serious. Chicago had a problem, and the problem was named Al Capone. His increasingly public and violent methods, culminating in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre just 3 months earlier, in February 1929, when Capone's men killed 7 members of the North Side Gang in a Chicago garage, had brought a level of federal attention to organized crime that threatened everyone. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was growing. The press was outraged. Politicians were being pressured to act. Capone's theatrics were making it hard for everyone else to operate quietly. The conference served multiple purposes. It was partly an attempt to establish peace between warring factions, to divide territories and revenue streams in ways that would reduce the violence that drew unwanted attention. It was partly a business meeting discussing distribution networks, pricing, the management of supply chains during Prohibition. And it was partly a message to Capone: your methods are a liability. You need to calm down. The outcome of the conference, whether by prior arrangement or genuine decision, was that Capone agreed to turn himself in to Philadelphia authorities on a weapons charge shortly after the conference ended. He would spend the next year in prison in Philadelphia, giving things time to cool down. Whether this was truly decided at Atlantic City or had been planned beforehand is still debated by historians. But the timing is remarkable, and the fact that Nucky Johnson City was chosen as the venue for this meeting tells you everything you need to know about his standing among the criminal elite of America in 1929. He wasn't just the boss of Atlantic City. He was respected, trusted, and sought out by men who were themselves among the most powerful operators in the country. His city was considered neutral ground, safe, protected, reliable. That reputation was the product of 30 years of careful, consistent governance, of always keeping his word, of always delivering what he promised, of running an operation so professionally that even Al Capone felt safe walking the boardwalk. During the peak Prohibition years, Atlantic City under Nucky Johnson was absolutely extraordinary. The city operated as if Prohibition simply did not exist. Hotels served liquor openly. Nightclubs poured drinks. Speakeasies weren't hidden, they were advertised. Celebrities came. Politicians came. Wealthy tourists came from across the country specifically because Atlantic City offered pleasures that were unavailable elsewhere. The city was called the world's playground, and the phrase was accurate in every sense. Here is where the television show diverged most significantly from reality. And here is where the true story becomes even more interesting than the fiction. On Boardwalk Empire, Nucky Thompson is a man of violence. He kills. He orders killings. He is personally, directly involved in the criminal operations of his empire in ways that regularly put him in physical danger. The show is a gangster drama, and it needs its protagonist to behave like a gangster. The real Nucky Johnson was not that man. Not because he lacked ruthlessness, he was absolutely ruthless. But his ruthlessness operated in a completely different register. It was financial, political, bureaucratic. He destroyed enemies not with bullets but with the withdrawal of political support, the cutting off of contracts, the sudden appearance of health inspectors at businesses that had previously been left alone, the unexpected attention of county prosecutors toward activities that had previously been overlooked. He could ruin a man completely, financially, professionally, socially, without anyone ever being physically harmed. And he preferred this method precisely because it left no evidence, created no witnesses, and generated no headlines about murder. His daily life was, in its physical details, quite different from what you might imagine. He woke up in his suite at the Ritz-Carlton and received visitors all morning. His office was wherever he happened to be: hotel lobby, restaurant table, park bench on the boardwalk. People came to him. They did not summon Nucky Johnson. He did not attend meetings in government buildings like an ordinary official. He conducted his business in the way of a feudal lord. People came to him, paid their respects, made their requests, received their answers, and left. The next person entered. He had a team of political lieutenants who handled the day-to-day operations of the machine. Men like Jimmy Nealis, who managed the ward operations. Men who collected the tribute payments from the city's illegal businesses. Men who managed the get-out-the-vote operations during elections. Men who handled the logistics of the liquor trade. Nucky himself sat above all of this, directing strategy, making final decisions, maintaining the most important relationships himself, but never personally handling the mechanics of anything that could be directly connected to criminal activity. His personal expenses were extraordinary. His wardrobe, custom suits, silk ties, handmade shoes, cost more annually than most Atlantic City families earned in a year. He entertained lavishly, meals at the finest restaurants, always picking up the check for everyone at the table. Parties thrown in his suite or at private clubs, with the best food, the best liquor, and entertainment that could include nationally known performers. He understood that generosity was a form of power, that every meal he paid for, every favor he extended, every dollar he gave to a struggling family, created a bond of loyalty or obligation that was worth more than the money spent. He was also a man of genuine personal complexity that the show hints at but never fully captures. His first wife, Mabel, died in 1910, and this loss marked him deeply. Mabel had gone into labor with their first child, and both she and the child died in what was, even by the standards of 1910 medical care, a devastating and avoidable tragedy. Accounts from people who knew Nucky suggest that this loss left a permanent wound. He carried a grief that never entirely healed. It was, perhaps, the one genuine vulnerability in a man who had armored himself against virtually every other form of pain. He had relationships with women throughout his adult life, several long-term arrangements and various shorter connections. His personal life was complicated, as you might expect from a man of enormous wealth and power who lived in a hotel and had no conventional domestic life. He eventually had a relationship with a woman named Flossie. Actually, two women by variations of that name appear in the historical record at different points in his life, and he was known for preferring the company of women who were sophisticated, stylish, and comfortable in the social world he inhabited. But his most important relationships were political. The network of senators, congressmen, governors, and presidential advisors that Nucky cultivated over 30 years was genuinely impressive. He was not merely a local boss. He was a national political figure with meaningful influence in the Republican Party at the national level. He delivered Atlantic County's votes with such consistency and such margins that Republican candidates at every level sought his endorsement and his support. Presidential campaigns sought his backing. Senators owed their elections partly to his organizational support. This gave him something that most criminal bosses never achieved: genuine political protection at the national level. The federal government, whose investigators and prosecutors were the only real threat to men of Nucky's local power, found it very difficult to pursue aggressive investigations into a man who had friends, allies, and obligated officials at high levels of the National Republican Party. This protection was not absolute. It would eventually fail. But for decades, it provided a layer of insulation that kept federal investigators at bay and allowed Nucky Johnson to operate with a security that should not have been possible. He was also a genuinely intelligent man in ways that get lost in the gangster narrative. He read. He understood economics and political science at a practical level that many formally educated men never achieved. He could discuss literature, history, and current events with sophistication. He was not the semi-literate street tough that popular imagination assigns to criminal bosses of his era. He was a man who had educated himself thoroughly in the school of practical politics and who could hold his own in conversation with any senator or business executive he encountered. His management of the organization's finances was meticulous. He understood, from watching the Commodore fall, that financial records were the enemy of powerful men. He kept very little on paper in his own name. Money flowed through the organization through intermediaries, through cash transactions, through arrangements that were structured to be impossible to trace directly to him. He had advisors, lawyers, and accountants who helped him structure his visible financial life in ways that appeared legitimate even as the actual sources of his income would have horrified any tax authority. This worked. For 30 years, it worked. Federal investigators knew what Nucky Johnson was. Everyone knew. The newspapers sometimes reported on it, carefully, with enough vagueness to avoid libel actions. The residents of Atlantic City knew their city was run by a political machine that was fundamentally corrupt. None of that knowledge translated into legal accountability, because knowledge and evidence are entirely different things, and Nucky Johnson was extremely careful about evidence. Every empire has a court. Nucky Johnson's court was populated by real human beings whose stories are, in some cases, more extraordinary than anything the television show invented. Let's start with the man who became the most famous criminal in American history, and whose relationship with Nucky was far more textured and interesting than the show had space to explore. Al Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919, the year before Prohibition began. He was 20 years old. He came from Brooklyn, sent by his mentor Johnny Torrio to help manage the Chicago operation. Within a decade, he would be the most powerful criminal in the country, and he would be a regular visitor to Nucky Johnson's Atlantic City throughout that decade. The relationship between Capone and Nucky was one of mutual respect and mutual benefit, but it was never one of equals. Nucky was older, more established, more politically sophisticated, and operating in a fundamentally different way than Capone. Capone's power was built on violence. Nucky's was built on political infrastructure. These were different tools, and the men who wielded them were, despite their friendship and professional connection, quite different personalities. Capone admired Nucky. He saw Atlantic City as a model of what organized crime could look like when it was fully integrated with legitimate political power, when the criminals weren't fighting the government but were, functionally, the government. This was the dream of every criminal boss, to be so embedded in the legitimate power structure that law enforcement became impossible. Nucky had achieved it. Capone had achieved something different, raw dominance through violence and terror, but he knew it was less stable, less durable, and more dangerous than what Nucky had built. Nucky, for his part, found Capone useful and genuinely liked him as a person. Accounts suggest their personal relationship had genuine warmth, but he was also clear-eyed about Capone's limitations as an operator. The violence that made Capone legendary was, from Nucky's perspective, a strategic weakness. It brought attention, created enemies. It made the federal government invest resources in destroying you that it would not have invested in a quieter, more politically protected operator. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was, to Nucky Johnson, an example of how not to run an empire. Lucky Luciano was a different kind of relationship entirely. Charles Lucky Luciano was the architect of modern American organized crime, the man who would eventually restructure the New York mob into the five-family system that defined the mafia for the rest of the 20th century. In the 1920s, he was still building his power in New York, navigating the treacherous politics of the existing power structure while positioning himself for the leadership role he would eventually claim. Luciano and Nucky's relationship was professional and transactional. They operated in connected but separate spheres. Nucky's Atlantic City was a useful asset for New York operations, particularly for liquor distribution and as a meeting place where New Yorkers could conduct business away from the eyes of New York law enforcement. Luciano respected what Nucky had built. Nucky respected Luciano's intelligence and organizational ability. They were business partners in the broadest sense. Their organizations needed each other, and both men understood that cooperation was more profitable than competition. Meyer Lansky was perhaps the most intellectually interesting figure in Nucky's orbit. Lansky, born Major Sucheljansky in Grodno in the Russian Empire, was a financial genius. Genuinely, historically a genius in the management and laundering of criminal money. He would go on to become the financial architect of organized crime in America for the next 5 decades, developing the offshore banking and casino operations that would define mob finance. In the late 1920s, he was in his 20s, already recognized by the most sophisticated operators as someone exceptional. Lansky's relationship with Nucky was based on shared appreciation for financial sophistication. Nucky understood, perhaps better than any other criminal boss of his era, that money management was the critical vulnerability of criminal enterprise. Lansky was developing the tools to address that vulnerability. Their connection was professional, based on mutual recognition of each other's skills, and would persist through the years even as their respective situations changed dramatically. The black political community in Atlantic City was, as mentioned earlier, an essential part of Nucky's power base. The show's character of Chalky White, Nucky Thompson's black ally and the leader of the African-American community in the fictional Atlantic City, was inspired by real relationships and real political dynamics, even if the specific character was invented. The real dynamics were more complicated and in some ways more interesting. Atlantic City's black community was large, organized, and politically active. Leaders within that community, ministers, business owners, community organizers, understood that their relationship with the white political machine was transactional by necessity. They couldn't control the machine, but they could negotiate with it. And Nucky Johnson, unlike many white political bosses of his era, was willing to negotiate seriously. He delivered jobs. He delivered access. He delivered a level of physical safety, the machine's protection extending to the black community in ways that were meaningful and real. In exchange, he received votes. Reliable, organized, consistent votes that he could count in his tallies when he was managing elections. This was not justice. It was not equality. It was the machine extending its tentacles into every community in the city, offering enough benefit to maintain loyalty and enough control to prevent opposition. But within that context, Nucky's relationships with black political leaders in Atlantic City were more functional and mutually beneficial than the relationships most of those communities had with white political power anywhere else in New Jersey in that era. The Rhinefield Syndicate, which managed the practical mechanics of Nucky's liquor operation, was led by Joseph Rhinefield, a Newark-based bootlegger who ran one of the most sophisticated alcohol importation and distribution operations on the East Coast. The Rhinefield operation imported Canadian whiskey through various offshore arrangements, moved it through Atlantic City's protected port facilities, and distributed it to speakeasies and private clubs throughout New Jersey, New York, and beyond. Nucky's organization provided the protection and the Atlantic City infrastructure. The Rhinefield people provided the operational expertise and the product. The arrangement worked smoothly for the entire duration of Prohibition. There were also figures around Nucky who were less sophisticated and more directly dangerous. Men who handled the situations where political pressure alone wasn't sufficient. These were not the glamorous hitmen of television gangster dramas. They were local thugs, ex-cops, political operatives who were willing to intimidate witnesses, rough up opponents, break up union organizing that threatened machine businesses, or handle the various situations where Nucky needed something done that couldn't be handled through political channels. Nucky maintained distance from these people. They were several layers removed from him in the organizational chart, but their existence was real and their function was understood by everyone in the organization. The figures who sat closest to Nucky in terms of daily operational trust were political men, lawyers, fixers, men who moved between the political and criminal worlds with the ease of people who understood that, in Atlantic City, those worlds were not actually separate. They translated between Nucky and the various constituencies he needed to manage: business owners, black community leaders, state politicians, federal officials, criminal associates. They were his diplomatic corps, and they were as essential to his operation as any bootlegger or political operative. By the mid-1920s, Enoch Lewis Johnson had achieved something that has almost never been duplicated in American history: total, comprehensive, institutional control of an entire metropolitan area. Not influence, not significant power, total control. Every judge in Atlantic County owed his seat to Nucky Johnson. Every prosecutor understood that ambitious prosecution of organization activities was a career-ending move. Every police chief had been appointed through Nucky's patronage and served at his pleasure. Every elected official from dogcatcher to state assemblyman had won their election with Nucky's support and would lose their next election without it. The legal system, The law enforcement apparatus, the tax and licensing structure, the municipal services, every formal mechanism of government in Atlantic County operated within a framework that Nucky Johnson had designed and maintained. His personal income during these peak years is worth dwelling on, because it illustrates the scale of what he had built. Federal investigators who later examined his finances estimated that he was personally collecting between $500,000 and $1 million annually during the height of Prohibition. That figure deserves some context. The median annual household income in the United States in 1925 was approximately $2,000. Nucky Johnson was earning, in a single year, what a typical American family would earn in 250 to 500 years. He was, in practical terms, as wealthy as any corporate executive or robber baron of his era, without a legitimate business to account for any of it. He spent this money with the kind of freedom that only comes from having more of it than you can actually use thoughtfully. The Ritz-Carlton suite was just the beginning. His wardrobe was the finest available. He was known across New Jersey and beyond as perhaps the most elegantly dressed man in public life, which in that era of formal dress and careful presentation was saying something significant. He gave money away constantly, to individuals, to charities, to political campaigns, to anyone who came to him with a compelling story of need. He threw parties and gatherings and celebrations that were, by all accounts, genuinely spectacular events, the kind of evening that guests remembered for the rest of their lives. He entertained national celebrities. Atlantic City in the 1920s was a destination for performers, athletes, entertainers, and public figures who wanted a vacation in a place with no questions and no restrictions. Nucky was the social center of this world. Knowing Nucky Johnson meant your stay in Atlantic City was perfect. The best tables at the best restaurants, access to the best entertainment, the guarantee that no unwanted complications would arise during your visit. He was the host of an enormous, permanent, incredibly expensive house party, and the entire city was his venue. The famous Atlantic City Boardwalk during this era was a genuinely extraordinary place. 6 miles long, wide enough for multiple lanes of traffic, lined on both sides with hotels, shops, restaurants, arcades, and entertainment venues of every description. Rolling chairs, wicker seats mounted on wheels, pushed by attendants, moved visitors along the boardwalk in the kind of elaborate leisure that seems almost incomprehensible today. Steel Pier extended far out into the ocean, hosting big band orchestras, diving horses, and theatrical performances. The great hotels, the Marlborough Blenheim, the Traymore, the Ritz-Carlton, the Ambassador, were architectural wonders of their era, enormous and grand and full of wealthy visitors from every corner of America. Nucky Johnson moved through all of this as its acknowledged master. He walked the boardwalk in his impeccable suits, greeting people by name, shaking hands, accepting deference from the business owners and hotel managers who lined his path. He was not a hidden power. He was the visible, celebrated, openly acknowledged leader of Atlantic City in every sense that mattered, even though his official title was merely county treasurer. Everyone knew. The newspapers knew. The tourists knew. The residents absolutely knew. And nobody did anything about it because in Atlantic City during the 1920s, nobody could. The city's statistics during this period are startling. Atlantic City attracted approximately 16 million visitors per year during the peak Prohibition years. 16 million. In a country of approximately 115 million people. 1 in 7 Americans visited Atlantic City in a single year. The city's hotels had a total capacity of hundreds of thousands of guests, and they operated at high occupancy throughout the season. The economic activity generated by this tourism was enormous, and all of it existed within the protective bubble that Nucky Johnson maintained. His political reach extended well beyond Atlantic County. He was one of the most important Republican Party bosses in New Jersey, and New Jersey was a key state in national elections. Presidential candidates sought his support. He attended national Republican conventions as an important delegate. He had relationships with sitting senators and congressmen throughout the state. When he made a call to Trenton or Washington, people took the call and listened to what he said. This national political connectivity gave him protection that pure criminal power could never provide. Federal investigators, even when they suspected the truth about Nucky Johnson, operated in a political environment where aggressive action against him carried risks. He had allies in high places. He had congressmen who owed him, He had senators who would make phone calls expressing displeasure at overzealous investigations. The federal government's institutional interest in pursuing Nucky Johnson was constantly balanced against the political costs of doing so, and for many years the political costs won. The physical city reflected his priorities in every way. Atlantic City's infrastructure, roads, utilities, public services, was maintained at the level necessary to support the tourism economy. Services that tourists didn't see were often neglected. The residential neighborhoods away from the boardwalk, where the working-class residents, many of them black workers in the service industry, actually lived, received far less attention and investment than the tourist corridors. This was not coincidence. The machine's interest was in maintaining the conditions that kept the money flowing. The well-being of ordinary residents was secondary to the performance of prosperity that brought tourists to the boardwalk. There is something important to confront here, because it would be easy to romanticize Nucky Johnson's Atlantic City. The nostalgia for the Prohibition era, fed by decades of gangster movies and television shows, can make the whole thing seem glamorous and exciting. And in certain very specific ways, the clothes, the music, the sheer audacity of the whole operation, it was. But underneath the glamour was a city where ordinary people had no meaningful political representation, where services were allocated based on loyalty to a political machine rather than genuine need, where black residents received second-class treatment despite being essential to the economy, and where the rule of law was simply not a real thing. The excitement of Nucky Johnson's Atlantic City was real, but so was its profound injustice. Nucky Johnson, the public figure, was a carefully constructed performance. The impeccable clothes, the red carnation, the easy charm, the open-handed generosity. These were real, but they were also strategic in the way that a politician's persona is always partly strategic. The question of who Nucky Johnson actually was behind that performance is harder to answer and more interesting. The death of his first wife, Mabel, in 1910 left a mark on him that persisted for decades. People who knew him well reported that he rarely spoke about her directly, that the wound was too deep for casual conversation. He had gone into that marriage with what appear to have been genuine feelings, genuine hope for a conventional life alongside his political career. The loss of both Mabel and their child in a single terrible event stripped that possibility away from him. After Mabel, he never established the kind of stable domestic life that most men of his era and class considered normal. He lived in hotels. He had relationships that were real but never quite settled. He was, perhaps, a man who had lost the capacity for the kind of vulnerability that ordinary domestic life requires. His relationship with money was complicated in ways that don't fit the simple narrative of a greedy criminal. He spent enormous amounts, but he also gave enormous amounts away. The charity and personal generosity were not entirely performative. He genuinely seemed to enjoy the act of helping people, of being the person someone turned to when they were in trouble. He had grown up watching his father, the sheriff, be the person people came to for help, and he had absorbed that role into his own identity. Being the man who could fix problems was not just politically useful to Nucky Johnson. It was, in some fundamental sense, who he understood himself to be. He was also a man who appreciated beauty, in architecture, in clothes, in music, in the presentation of food and entertainment. The attention to aesthetics that made his parties legendary was not simply calculated. It reflected a genuine sensibility. He cared about things being done well, done beautifully, done at the highest possible standard. This fastidiousness extended to his political operations, which were run with a precision and professionalism that his peers recognized and respected. He didn't just want to be powerful. He wanted to be excellent. The ambition and the aesthetic sense were intertwined. His relationship with his father remained important throughout his life. Smith Johnson had given Enoch the foundation for everything: the political education, the introduction to the county's power structure, the understanding of how favors and relationships and institutional positions could be wielded. When Smith Johnson died, Nucky honored him publicly in ways that made clear the depth of his feeling. The father had been the model. The son had simply taken the model to its absolute extreme. He had a complicated relationship with the Catholic Church, attending Mass with the kind of visible regularity that served his public image, but maintaining a personal life that was considerably less pious than his Sunday appearances suggested. This tension between public religiosity and private conduct was common enough among political bosses of his era that it barely registered as noteworthy. People expected a certain amount of hypocrisy in their political leaders. Nucky provided it in the standard quantity. His relationship with alcohol is worth noting specifically because it sits at the center of such a significant portion of his career. Nucky Johnson drank. He enjoyed drinking. He kept the best liquor in his suite and served it freely to guests. He was not a man who was personally conflicted about the trade that made him wealthy. He believed sincerely and articulately that prohibition was a mistake, that attempting to legislate personal behavior of this kind was both philosophically wrong and practically counterproductive. These were views he shared openly. He was not secretive about his contempt for the 18th Amendment. He thought it was bad law and he behaved accordingly. He was also, by all accounts, funny. Genuinely funny, quick with a story, capable of self-deprecating humor about his own position, able to defuse tense situations with a well-timed joke. This quality, which rarely makes it into historical accounts of powerful men, was part of what made him so effective at maintaining the loyalty of such a diverse range of people. You can endure a lot from someone who makes you laugh. The humor was real, and it was disarming, and it was part of why so many people who worked for or with Nucky Johnson genuinely liked him even as they understood exactly what kind of man he was. The first crack in Nucky Johnson's empire appeared not with a criminal investigation or a political opponent. It appeared with the stock market crash of October 1929. Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, sent shock waves through the American economy that would reshape the country for the next decade. The tourism economy of Atlantic City, built on the discretionary spending of wealthy and middle-class Americans, was devastatingly vulnerable to exactly this kind of shock. When Americans lost their money, they stopped taking vacations. They stopped spending on resort hotels. They stopped doing the very things that made Atlantic City what it was. The great hotels began struggling. Businesses on the boardwalk contracted. The river of tourist money that had flowed through Atlantic City for decades slowed to a trickle. And with it, the revenue that Nucky's organization collected at every point of that flow, from hotel operators, from nightclubs, from gambling operations, from all the businesses whose survival depended on tourist spending, fell dramatically. Nucky adapted. He was too experienced and too intelligent simply to watch his operation contract without response. He worked to maintain political relationships and diversify the organization's revenue where possible. But the fundamental economic reality of the Depression was not something that could be managed or manipulated away. Atlantic City was suffering, and that suffering touched everything Nucky had built. Then, on December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified. Prohibition was over. This is one of the most significant moments in Nucky Johnson's entire story, and it is worth pausing on. Prohibition had been the engine of his greatest wealth. For 13 years, the illegality of alcohol had meant that the entire liquor trade, its importation, distribution, retail sale, everything, had been channeled through criminal organizations that needed political protection. Nucky had provided that protection, and he had collected his percentage of every bottle that moved through his city. The repeal of prohibition did not simply reduce this revenue. It eliminated it. Legal alcohol could now be sold by legitimate businesses. Those businesses didn't need Nucky's protection because they weren't doing anything illegal. The bootleggers, the rum runners, the smugglers, the speakeasies, all of them had the option of going legitimate or going out of business. The illegal liquor trade that had made Nucky enormously wealthy essentially ceased to exist as a criminal enterprise. He still had his political machine. He still had his control of county government. He still had the gambling tribute and the protection money from other illegal businesses. But the single largest revenue stream of the Prohibition era was gone, and it could not be replaced. Meanwhile, the political environment was shifting in ways that created new vulnerabilities. The Depression had discredited the Republican Party nationally. Franklin Roosevelt's Democrats swept to power in 1932, and their ascent brought new political figures and new priorities to New Jersey as well. Democratic governors and politicians who owed nothing to Nucky Johnson and had every incentive to attack the Atlantic County machine began gaining influence at the state level. New federal agencies with expanded mandates and resources were also looking more carefully at political corruption. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was growing in capability and ambition. The Internal Revenue Service, which had successfully prosecuted Al Capone on tax evasion charges in 1931, was looking for similar cases. The template for destroying men like Nucky Johnson had been established. The IRS had proven that you didn't need to prove specific criminal acts if you could prove that someone's lifestyle was incompatible with their reported income. Capone's fall was instructive in another way. When the federal government committed fully to destroying him, when it assigned teams of investigators, when it made his prosecution a political priority, even Capone's considerable protection couldn't withstand the pressure. The lesson was clear. Local political protection could shield a criminal boss from local law enforcement indefinitely. It could not shield him from a determined federal government with unlimited investigative resources and a political incentive to make an example. Nucky watched Capone go to prison in 1931. He understood what it meant. He began to think more carefully about his financial arrangements, about the paper trails that might exist, about the witnesses who might someday be persuaded to talk. But he had been operating for so long in an environment of absolute local immunity that truly preparing for federal scrutiny required changes that were difficult to make after 30 years of somewhat comfortable habits. New political enemies emerged within New Jersey itself. Men who wanted Atlantic County's political machine for themselves, or who simply wanted Nucky removed as a competing power center in state Republican politics. These enemies began cooperating quietly, carefully with federal investigators who were building a case. The whisper network that had always protected Nucky began to develop leaks. People who had previously been loyal began to consider the possibility that loyalty to Nucky Johnson might not be worth what it had once been worth. The Depression had done something specific and damaging to Nucky's position. It had reduced the machine's ability to deliver. When the machine could deliver jobs, contracts, protection, and financial support, loyalty was rational. But when the machine was itself struggling, when the jobs were fewer, the contracts smaller, the protection less reliable, the calculation changed. People who had been loyal to the machine because it provided real benefits began to wonder whether the arrangement was still worth maintaining. And in that environment of weakened loyalty and intensified federal scrutiny, things began to happen. The federal investigation into Nucky Johnson's finances began seriously in the late 1930s. And the critical moment, the moment when the investigation went from a theoretical threat to an existential one, was when people who had been inside the machine started talking to federal prosecutors. This is always how these empires fall. Not with dramatic confrontations or violent overthrows. With men sitting in small rooms across from federal agents, deciding that the personal costs of loyalty have exceeded the personal benefits, and beginning to answer questions honestly. The specific mechanism of Nucky's downfall was, just as it had been with Capone, income tax evasion. Nucky Johnson had been receiving enormous amounts of money, from the organization, from political assessments, from various sources of machine income, that he had not been reporting to the Internal Revenue Service. This was not a technicality. The amounts were massive, the years of non-reporting were many, and the paper trail, once investigators knew where to look and had witnesses to guide them, was more substantial than Nucky had believed. A grand jury investigation in Atlantic County created the legal mechanism for compelling testimony. Witnesses who might have been willing to stay silent in the past now faced a different calculation. Testify or face contempt charges, perjury charges, and potentially criminal charges related to their own activities within the machine. The machine's protective power had always depended on its ability to shield its members from exactly this kind of pressure. But the machine's ability to provide that shield had weakened significantly through the Depression years. And former associates who no longer believed in the machine's power to protect them were much more willing to cooperate with investigators. Murray Hummel was among the associates who provided damaging testimony. Others who had been involved in the financial operations of the machine, men who had handled tribute payments, political assessments, and other flows of money that should have been reported as income, began describing to investigators exactly how the system had worked. The picture that emerged from their testimony was one of comprehensive financial fraud on a massive scale, sustained over many years, organized and maintained by Enoch Lewis Johnson personally. The investigators also did something clever and important. They found the physical evidence of Nucky's lifestyle and compared it to his reported income. The Ritz-Carlton suite, the wardrobe, the entertaining, the gifts, the charitable donations, the travel. All of these things cost money, enormous amounts of money, far more money than Nucky Johnson's official government salary could possibly have paid for. And Nucky's tax returns reflected an income that bore no relationship to these expenditures. This is the IRS method, the same one used against Capone, and it works because it is essentially airtight as a matter of logic. If you spent X dollars, you must have received X dollars. If you received X dollars, you must report X dollars as income. If your tax returns show income dramatically below X, you have committed tax fraud. The complexity lies in documenting the expenditures, establishing the income gap, and proving criminal intent rather than innocent error. In Nucky Johnson's case, the expenditures were easy to document. He had lived his entire life as a very public figure in a small city, and everyone knew what he spent. The income gap was enormous, and the existence of a coordinated political machine with multiple revenue streams was exactly the kind of evidence of intent that prosecutors needed. Nucky, characteristically, maintained confidence that the investigation would not ultimately succeed. He had survived threats before. He had relationships with powerful people. He believed that the machine could withstand this pressure as it had withstood previous pressure. But the machine was weaker now than it had ever been, and the federal government was more committed than it had ever been, and the witnesses were talking. His lawyers were excellent, he could afford the best, and they worked to limit the damage, to challenge the evidence, to create alternative narratives that might create reasonable doubt. Nucky cooperated with the investigation to a limited extent, providing some financial information while maintaining that his income had been legitimate contributions to political operations rather than personal enrichment. The investigation was meticulous. Federal agents spent years examining financial records, interviewing witnesses, tracing money flows, documenting expenditures. They were building the kind of case that could survive appellate review, that could withstand the cross-examination of the best defense lawyers Nucky's money could buy. By the time they were ready to seek an indictment, they had a file that was essentially unanswerable. In 1941, a federal grand jury indicted Enoch Lewis Johnson on charges of federal income tax evasion. The trial of Nucky Johnson was a public event in a way that few criminal proceedings in New Jersey history have been. Newspapers covered it extensively. People who had spent their entire lives under the umbrella of his machine, people who had worked for him, benefited from him, feared him, admired him, watched closely. It was the most dramatic political event in Atlantic City's history, more dramatic in its way than any election, because for the first time in 3 decades, it was genuinely unclear what would happen next. Nucky arrived for trial as he had arrived for everything in his life, immaculately dressed, composed, displaying a public confidence that was either genuine or brilliantly performed. He was 58 years old by the time the trial began. He had spent nearly 40 years as the most powerful man in Atlantic County. He had faced investigation before. He had navigated challenges before. He believed, or at least projected the belief, that he would navigate this one too. The prosecution's case was constructed around the fundamental tax evasion framework, supported by the testimony of former associates who described in detailed, specific terms exactly how the machine's money had flowed, and how a portion of it had consistently ended up enriching Nucky Johnson personally while none of it was reported to the IRS. They presented financial records, bank statements, records of expenditures, and the testimony of witnesses who had direct knowledge of specific transactions. The prosecution established a clear pattern: large amounts of cash moving through political organizations, tribute payments from businesses, assessments on government employees, all of it ending up, in various ways, contributing to the lavish lifestyle of the county treasurer. The amount of income that had not been reported was calculated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars over multiple years. The tax liability that had been evaded was enormous. Nucky's defense team argued that the money in question was not personal income but rather political contributions and party funds, money that had been entrusted to him as a party official for political purposes, not received by him as personal income. This was his consistent public position. He was a political organizer managing campaign and party resources, not a man who had personally enriched himself through criminal means. It was a creative argument. It was the argument a skilled defense attorney would make. But it had a fundamental problem: the expenditures. Nucky's lifestyle, the hotel suite, the clothes, the entertaining, the gifts cost money that political contributions, even enormous ones, could not plausibly account for. The prosecution could point to specific expenditures and ask, if this money was not yours personally, why did you spend it on silk suits and restaurant meals and personal gifts? Political party funds did not pay for those things. The jury heard the evidence over the course of the trial. They heard the prosecution's witnesses describe the machine's operations from the inside. They heard the financial analysis establishing the gap between Nucky's reported income and his documented lifestyle. They heard the defense's counter-narrative. And then they deliberated. The verdict came back, guilty. 4 counts of federal income tax evasion. Enoch Lewis Johnson, the most powerful man in Atlantic County, the boss who had run his city for 30 years, the man who had hosted Al Capone and Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky in his hotel, the man who had delivered elections and protected bootleggers and built a political machine that had seemed, for decades, genuinely untouchable, was convicted. The sentencing followed. 4 years in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. The courtroom, by all accounts, was very quiet. Nucky Johnson looked at the sentence with the same composure he had shown throughout the trial. No dramatic outburst. No public collapse. He absorbed the information and processed it privately, in the way of a man who had spent 40 years never allowing others to see him genuinely shaken. But he was shaken. Anyone would have been. At 58 years old, facing prison, watching the empire of his life's work begin to dissolve. That is a moment of reckoning that no amount of preparation can make comfortable. He was taken to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. Not Alcatraz, not a maximum security facility. Lewisburg was a medium security federal prison, and Nucky's resources ensured that his accommodation there was as comfortable as such accommodation could be. He received visitors. He maintained correspondence. He followed what was happening in Atlantic City, watching from prison as his political machine, without its builder and protector, began to lose its shape. The machine didn't collapse overnight. Some of his associates attempted to maintain the organizational structure. But the energy, the relationships, and the authority that had held it all together had been Nucky Johnson personally. Without him present, without his direct management of the thousands of individual relationships that made the machine work, it began to decay. Elections were lost that had previously been guaranteed. Rival factions within the Republican Party seized territory that had been inviolably Nucky's. The economic depression of the war years continued to strain the resort economy. The machine's patronage resources shrank as its electoral power diminished. 3 years and a few months after entering Lewisburg, Nucky Johnson walked out. He came back to Atlantic City in 1945. He was 62 years old. The city he had owned was different. The war had changed everything: the economy, the culture, the political dynamics. The political machine that had seemed permanent was damaged, diminished, partially dismantled. His allies were scattered, dead, or had made accommodations with the new power structure. The world had moved on while he was in Lewisburg, and it had not waited for him. The Ritz-Carlton suite was gone. He could no longer afford it in the way he once had, and the symbolism of reclaiming it would have been complicated in any case. He lived more quietly, more privately, in the physical spaces of the city he had once commanded, but moving through them as a private citizen rather than a sovereign. He made attempts to reconnect, to rebuild, to use the relationships and the political capital that still existed. But the landscape had changed too fundamentally. The men who would have needed to be recruited, supported, and organized into a new machine were operating in a different political environment. One where the Atlantic County Republican machine was no longer the dominant institutional force it had been. New Jersey politics had evolved. The city's relationship with the state government had shifted. The federal presence that had prosecuted Nucky was ongoing. Anyone who helped him rebuild was exposed to exactly the kind of federal scrutiny that had destroyed him. He was, for the first time in his adult life, without power. The experience of this powerlessness, after decades of absolute control, was something that people who knew him in these later years describe as quietly devastating. Not dramatic, not self-pitying, just diminished. A man who had been entirely defined by his role and his power, now without either. He went to restaurants and was still recognized, still treated with a residual respect, still greeted by people who remembered what he had been. But recognition is not power. Deference is not authority. The social performances of respect are hollow when everyone in the room knows that the person being respected can no longer actually do anything for them. He had financial resources, savings from the decades of enormous income. But they were not unlimited, and his access to the ongoing revenue streams of the machine was gone. He lived reasonably well but not extravagantly. The wardrobe remained old habits, and the clothes were already paid for. But the lifestyle that had expressed his power so visibly during his peak years was no longer sustainable. He talked to some journalists in his later years, occasionally carefully, never saying anything directly incriminating, but allowing glimpses of reflection on his career. He did not repent in any conventional sense. He did not express regret for the operations he had run or the methods he had used. He seemed to genuinely believe, as he had always believed, that Atlantic City's economy required the kind of management he had provided. That the prohibition of vices people were going to pursue regardless of the law was foolish, and that providing a safe, organized environment for those vices was a form of public service. He was not without a philosophy. It was just a philosophy that many people found convenient to hold when it had made them very wealthy. The city around him continued to change. The political machines that had characterized American city politics through the first half of the 20th century were weakening everywhere, under pressure from reform movements, from federal oversight, from the growth of bureaucratic government that was less susceptible to individual political control. Atlantic City's specific corruption continued in various forms after Nucky. His successors maintained some elements of the machine, but it was never again the total, comprehensive, institutionally embedded system that Nucky had built and maintained. Tourism continued. The boardwalk continued. The hotels and restaurants and shops continued. But the particular atmosphere of Atlantic City during Prohibition, the sense of a city entirely unto itself, exempt from normal rules, presided over by a single authoritative figure, was gone. It would not return in that form. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Nucky Johnson faded from public life. He was occasionally mentioned in newspaper retrospectives about the Prohibition era, a historical curiosity, a figure from a dramatic and colorful period of American history that was already acquiring the romantic glow that distance gives to even the most genuinely corrupt eras. People who had been children during his reign remembered him fondly. The generosity, the Christmas turkeys, the money given to struggling families, the image of the elegantly dressed man on the boardwalk who knew everyone and could fix anything. Nostalgia is a powerful editor. It keeps the things that feel good and gently puts aside the things that were ugly. His health declined through the mid-1960s. He was an old man now, genuinely old, in his 80s, the body failing in the ways that bodies fail after 8 decades of heavy use. The Atlantic City of the 1960s was in its own decline, the resort economy weakening, the great hotels aging, the demographics of tourism shifting in ways that were not favorable to the old boardwalk model. On December 9, 1968, Enoch Louis Johnson died in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He was 85 years old. He died in the city he had once owned, surrounded by people who remembered, even if the rest of the world had largely moved on. No dramatic ending, no violence, no betrayal, just 85 years of an extraordinary American life, ending quietly in the city by the sea that had been the stage for all of it. We touched on the 1929 Atlantic City Conference earlier. But this event deserves much deeper examination, because it is one of the most historically significant events in American criminal history and one of the most underreported stories of the Prohibition era. May 1929. The world's most powerful criminals gathered in one place. Not secretly, not furtively, but in a first-class hotel in a major American resort city, eating in the restaurant, walking on the boardwalk, meeting in hotel suites. The sheer audacity of it reflects exactly how complete Nucky Johnson's control of Atlantic City was. The conference could not have happened anywhere else in America. Every other city had law enforcement that might have intervened, politicians who might have used it against their opponents, newspapers that might have reported it in ways that forced official action. Atlantic City had none of these vulnerabilities. Nucky Johnson City was genuinely safe, for everyone he decided should be safe within it. The roster of attendees, assembled from the historical record, is remarkable. From Chicago, Al Capone and his associates. From New York, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Dutch Schultz's representatives, Arnold Rothstein's network people, though Rothstein himself had been murdered the previous November. From Philadelphia, Waxy Gordon and his associates. From Cleveland, the Mayfield Road Gang, including Mo Dalitz. From Detroit, representatives of the Purple Gang. From Boston, King Solomon. From New England and New Jersey, various other major bootlegging and gambling operators. These men represented, collectively, the most significant criminal enterprises in the eastern United States. They controlled the bootlegging networks that supplied liquor to tens of millions of Americans. They ran gambling operations of enormous scale. They managed labor rackets, protection operations, and other criminal enterprises throughout their respective territories. And they were all in the same hotel at the same time for the same reason, to talk. The conversations that happened at the President Hotel over those several days in May 1929 were about the future of American organized crime. Specifically, could it become more organized? Could the violent, chaotic, territorial competition that had characterized criminal enterprise in the early Prohibition years, the gang wars, the turf battles, the killings, be replaced by something more businesslike? Could criminal organizations negotiate territory, divide revenue streams, and establish protocols for resolving disputes without the kind of violence that attracted federal attention and made everyone's lives difficult? Capone's St. Valentine's Day massacre had demonstrated the problem clearly. The killing of 7 members of Bugs Moran's North Side Gang, machine-gunned in a garage while Capone established an alibi in Florida, had shocked the country. The media coverage was enormous. The public pressure on law enforcement to do something about organized crime reached a new peak. And every criminal boss in America understood that Capone's theatrics had made their own operations more dangerous. The conference debated whether American organized crime could be restructured into something less violent and more stable. The concept that would eventually become the National Crime Syndicate, a cooperative framework among major criminal organizations that would allow them to coexist and prosper without the destructive territorial warfare of the early Prohibition years, was in its early stages of development. The Atlantic City Conference was one of the key moments in that development. The specific outcomes of the conference are somewhat obscured by the fact that none of the participants left detailed records, and the conference itself was not officially acknowledged by anyone present. Historical understanding of what was decided comes from later statements by participants, FBI files compiled over subsequent years, and the circumstantial evidence of what actually happened in the years following the conference. What historians generally agree on: the conference established or reinforced territorial agreements between the major organizations present. Chicago would be Capone's. New York's multiple factions would find a way to coexist. The distribution networks that moved liquor across state lines would be managed cooperatively rather than competitively, sharing access to supply chains and eliminating some of the friction that had been costing everyone money and creating dangerous conflicts. The decision about Capone, or the discussion of Capone's situation, if not a formal decision, also happened here. Capone was advised, by the assembled bosses who valued stability over spectacle, that his methods were a problem for the entire community. He needed to reduce his profile. He needed to become less visible, less dramatic, less likely to trigger federal responses. Shortly after the conference, Capone turned himself in to Philadelphia police on a weapons charge and spent the next year in prison. Whether this was pre-planned, negotiated at the conference, or simply Capone's independent decision to follow the advice he received remains a question historians debate. But the sequence is striking. Nucky Johnson's role in all of this was that of host, facilitator, and respected neutral party. He was not the most powerful criminal figure present in terms of pure criminal muscle. Capone had more men. New York had more money. But Nucky had something they all valued: legitimacy in the sense of political establishment, neutral territory where business could be conducted safely, and a reputation for keeping his word and maintaining his arrangements. He was trusted in a world where trust was the most valuable and scarcest commodity. The conference also reinforced Nucky's value to the broader network of organized crime on the East Coast. He was not just a local boss in a resort town. He was the man who could bring these people together, whose city was safe, whose word was good, whose political protection was real. That was worth something. It was worth a great deal, in fact, in the ongoing relationships between Atlantic City's machine and the criminal organizations that used the city as a waypoint and a meeting place. The story of how Nucky Johnson was finally brought down is, at its core, a story about two competing institutional systems, his local political machine and the federal government's law enforcement and taxation apparatus, and what happens when they finally fully engage with each other. For 30 years, they had been in something like an armed standoff. The federal presence in Atlantic City was aware of what Nucky's operation was. Periodic investigations had been opened, poked at the organization's edges, and retreated. Nucky's political connections had provided some protection. The complexity of the machine made building prosecutable cases difficult, and there was always the question of political cost. Nucky had friends in high places, and a federal administration that aggressively prosecuted him would pay a political price. But several things changed in the 1930s that shifted the balance. The New Deal era brought a Democratic administration to Washington that owed nothing to New Jersey's Republican machine and had no particular reason to protect it. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was growing more sophisticated and more ambitious. The IRS, emboldened by its success against Capone, was actively looking for similar cases. Political bosses with enormous unexplained income were exactly the kind of target that fit its developing playbook. And Atlantic County's machine was weaker. The Depression had reduced its resources. The repeal of Prohibition had eliminated its most profitable revenue stream. The political environment in New Jersey had shifted in ways that isolated the Atlantic County machine from some of its former state-level protection. The machine was still functional, but it was a machine running on reduced fuel, and the federal agencies pursuing it were growing stronger. The investigation that eventually produced Nucky's indictment was methodical to an extreme. Federal agents spent years building the case, identifying the financial flows, interviewing witnesses, developing the testimony of former machine insiders, examining financial records wherever they could be obtained. They were building not just a prosecutable case, but an airtight one. They knew that Nucky would have the best legal defense that money could buy, and they wanted to present a body of evidence that would survive the most aggressive cross-examination. The specific witnesses who testified against Nucky were former associates, men who had been inside the machine, who had direct knowledge of specific financial transactions, who could describe under oath exactly how tribute payments were collected, how political assessments were levied, how money moved through the organization and some portion of it ended up enhancing Nucky's personal lifestyle. These witnesses had been persuaded to cooperate through a combination of their own legal jeopardy and the credible threat that the federal government was going to win regardless. That cooperation was in their personal interest. The tax charges were ultimately simple in their structure, even if complex in their documentation. Nucky Johnson had received hundreds of thousands of dollars in unreported income over multiple years. He had filed tax returns that dramatically understated his actual income. He had done so deliberately, as part of an organized effort to conceal the sources and amounts of his income from federal authorities. These were the facts. The prosecution documented them exhaustively and convincingly. The trial's outcome, guilty on 4 counts, was, in retrospect, probably inevitable once the investigation had produced the quality of evidence the federal government assembled. The legal architecture of the charges was sound. The evidence was substantial. The witnesses were credible. And the fundamental story the prosecution was telling, that this man had lived an extraordinarily expensive life funded by criminal tribute while reporting a tiny fraction of his actual income to the tax authorities, was simply true. The jury could see that it was true, and they convicted. What the trial also revealed, and what its aftermath confirmed, was the fundamental fragility of even the most durable local power structure when confronted with a determined federal government. Nucky Johnson had been untouchable for 30 years because the local institutions that might have challenged him, local law enforcement, local courts, local political structures, were all under his control. The federal government was not. It operated outside his sphere of influence. And when it finally committed fully to his prosecution, his local protections were irrelevant. This is a lesson that has echoed through American political history. Local political machines, no matter how complete their control of local institutions, are ultimately vulnerable to federal action. The political protection that Nucky enjoyed at the national level, his Republican Party connections, his relationships with senators and representatives, slowed the federal effort but could not stop it once the institutional momentum was established and the evidence was assembled. Boardwalk Empire premiered on HBO on September 19, 2010, with a pilot episode directed by Martin Scorsese that was, by any measure, one of the most spectacular hours of television ever produced. The show ran for 5 seasons, ending in 2014, and it was throughout its run one of the most critically acclaimed programs on American television. It was also, in significant ways, a work of creative imagination that used the real history of Atlantic City and Nucky Johnson as a launching pad for a fictional narrative that diverged from reality in ways both large and small. This is not a criticism of the show. Television drama requires narrative compression, invented characters, and fictional events. It cannot simply dramatize the historical record. It needs protagonists who take dramatic action, antagonists who create conflict, relationships that generate emotional stakes. The real Nucky Johnson, operating primarily through political manipulation and financial control, would be harder to dramatize than the fictional Nucky Thompson, who shoots people and orders murders and navigates violent confrontations. The show made the choices it needed to make to function as drama. But the differences are revealing, and they illuminate something important about the real story. The most significant difference is in how power is exercised. The fictional Nucky Thompson is directly involved in violence. He kills Jimmy Darmody at the end of Season 2 in one of the show's most dramatically significant moments. He orders murders. He is personally threatened with violence by opponents and responds in kind. His power has a physical, violent dimension that is always present and sometimes decisive. The real Nucky Johnson's power was almost entirely non-violent. He did not personally kill anyone. He almost certainly did not order killings, at least not directly. The violence that surrounded the organization, which was real, which existed at the edges of the machine's operations, was not something Nucky was personally involved in. His weapons were votes, contracts, licenses, political pressure, and economic leverage. These were more effective weapons than guns in the world he operated in, and they left no bodies and no forensic evidence. Jimmy Darmody, the show's most emotionally central character in its early seasons, is entirely fictional. There was no equivalent figure in Nucky Johnson's real history. The dynamic of the older mentor and the younger protege, the complicated love and eventual deadly conflict between Nucky Thompson and Jimmy Darmody, is one of the show's most powerful narrative engines. It has no basis in the historical record. The character of Margaret Schroeder, the Irish immigrant widow who becomes Nucky Thompson's love interest and eventually his wife, is similarly fictional, though she draws on the general reality that Nucky Johnson had significant relationships with women throughout his life, some of whom occupied social positions that were complicated by his power and wealth. Chalky White, as mentioned previously, is a fictional character who draws on the real dynamics of Nucky's relationship with Atlantic City's black political community. The show uses this character to explore themes of race, power, and the complicated alliances that political machines built across racial lines. The specific character is invented, but the underlying political dynamic, the machine's deliberate cultivation of black political support in exchange for tangible benefits, is historically accurate. The show's portrayal of the 1929 Atlantic City Conference is, by contrast, one of the most historically grounded elements of the entire series. The conference happened. Al Capone was there. The discussions were of the general nature portrayed. The hotel, the boardwalk setting, the gathering of criminal bosses from across the country. All of this is historically documented. The show dramatizes the conversations and adds fictional elements, but the basic fact of the conference and its participants is accurate. Al Capone's recurring presence in the show, played memorably by Stephen Graham, reflects the real relationship between Capone and Nucky, though the specific interactions shown are dramatized. The general dynamic. Nucky is more sophisticated and politically embedded. Capone is more flamboyant and violent. The professional respect between them and the tension over their different methods. This captures something real about how these men related to each other. The show's treatment of Prohibition-era Atlantic City as a place of extraordinary excess and open illegality is accurate in its broad strokes. The atmosphere, the sense of a city that operated by its own rules, is historically correct. The specific events dramatized are largely fictional, but the context and the culture are real. The show's ending, in which the aged Nucky Thompson is shot and killed on the boardwalk by a young man seeking revenge for events that trace back to the show's earliest seasons, is fictional. The real Nucky Johnson was not killed. He was not shot. He died of natural causes at 85 years old, in his bed, in the city where he had spent his entire life. The show's dramatic ending is emotionally satisfying within the narrative it has constructed. The real ending, a quiet death at an advanced age, after years of powerless obscurity, is more melancholy and, in its way, more fitting for the actual story of a man who outlived his empire. One thing the show genuinely captures, and that is worth acknowledging, is the human cost of power. The toll that Nucky Thompson's choices take on the people around him, his wife, his protégés, his associates, is dramatized with real emotional intelligence. The real Nucky Johnson's choices also had human costs. The machine's operation depended on the exploitation of political and economic arrangements that harmed ordinary people. The corruption it maintained prevented the city's genuine democratic development. The protection it provided to illegal businesses was a protection that also protected the exploitation of vulnerable people who depended on those businesses. The show gestures at these costs, even if it sometimes romanticizes what it's showing. Here is the deepest and most important truth about Enoch Lewis Johnson's story. He was not an aberration. He was not a uniquely corrupt figure who somehow forced himself upon a healthy democratic system. He was the product of a system that produced men like him consistently, in city after city across America, for the better part of a century. The era of the political machine, roughly from the 1870s through the 1950s, was defined by the Nucky Johnsons of American politics. Tammany Hall in New York City, the Hague Machine in Jersey City, the Pendergast Machine in Kansas City, the Crump Machine in Memphis, the Daley Machine in Chicago, the Curley Machine in Boston. Each of these was a comprehensive political organization that controlled elections, managed patronage, provided services to loyal constituents, and generated personal enrichment for its leaders through the same basic mechanisms that Nucky used in Atlantic City. These machines existed and thrived because they filled a real function. In an era before the modern welfare state, before civil service protections, before strong regulatory frameworks, the political machine was often the most effective mechanism available for connecting ordinary people with the resources and services they needed. You needed a job? The machine knew who was hiring government employees. You needed a problem resolved with a city agency? The machine's ward boss would call someone. You were new to the country and didn't understand the system? The machine would help you navigate it at a price. The machine was corrupt. It was also, in many cases, genuinely useful to the people who participated in it. This is not an argument in defense of political corruption. It is an argument for understanding what political corruption actually is. Not a simple moral failure by individual bad actors, but a systemic phenomenon that emerges from specific social and institutional conditions. The political machine flourished because American democratic institutions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not strong enough, not well designed enough, not sufficiently resourced to provide what ordinary people needed from government without the intermediation of the machine. Nucky Johnson's particular genius was in understanding this functional reality and exploiting it with extraordinary sophistication. He didn't just take money from the system. He made himself genuinely useful to enough people in enough ways that his removal, even his prosecution, was politically complicated. People who had received Christmas turkeys from his organization, or who had gotten a government job through the machine, or who had had a problem fixed by a ward boss. These people understood abstractly that Nucky Johnson was corrupt, but they also felt something like loyalty or gratitude to the system that had helped them. That mixture of genuine benefit and corruption is what made the machine so durable. Atlantic City also represented something specific about American culture in the Prohibition era, the gap between official morality and actual behavior. Prohibition was passed into law because a specific political coalition, rooted in Protestant rural America, deeply suspicious of immigrant urban culture, succeeded in translating their moral preferences into constitutional law. But tens of millions of Americans who had voted for or tolerated Prohibition continued to drink. They didn't suddenly discover that alcohol was wrong just because the law said so. They found ways to keep drinking, which meant they needed people who would provide the alcohol illegally. Nucky Johnson was the supply for that demand. His operation served real needs that real people had. The fact that serving those needs was illegal did not make the needs themselves go away. And the gap between what the law said and what people actually wanted created exactly the space that men like Nucky Johnson occupied and profited from. The lesson that his entire career teaches, the lesson that the history of Prohibition more broadly teaches, is that criminalizing widespread, deeply desired human behavior does not eliminate that behavior. It changes who provides it and at what price. When alcohol was legal, it was provided by legitimate businesses competing openly in a marketplace. When it was illegal, it was provided by political bosses and criminal organizations that extracted monopoly profits from the arrangement. The Prohibition experiment was, by almost any measure, a failure. It did not significantly reduce drinking in America. It did enrich criminal organizations enormously and embed them in American political and social life in ways that took decades to partially dismantle. Nucky Johnson was the beneficiary of that policy failure, but he did not create it. He simply recognized the opportunity it created and exploited it with everything he had. Atlantic City did not become a paradise after Nucky Johnson went to prison. That might seem obvious, but it's worth stating clearly, because it cuts against any narrative that frames Nucky as the source of the city's problems rather than a product of its particular character. The machine he built was damaged by his prosecution but not destroyed. His successors, men who had operated within his organization and understood how it worked, maintained a modified version of the machine through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Atlantic County politics remained notably, if less comprehensively, corrupt for decades after Nucky's conviction. The culture of deal-making, patronage, and political accommodation that had characterized the city under Nucky did not evaporate because its architect went to prison. The city itself went into a long decline through the 1950s and 1960s. Automobile culture and the expansion of leisure options across America meant that the resort economy that had depended on the uniqueness of Atlantic City, on the fact that it was one of relatively few places offering oceanfront entertainment, was weakened by competition. Airlines were making distance travel more accessible. Television was keeping people home. The specific glamour of the pre-war Atlantic City boardwalk, the rolling chairs, the great hotels, the sense of being in the most fashionable resort destination in America, faded as the hotels aged, the infrastructure deteriorated, and the visitors who had money to spend began finding other places to spend it. The famous hotels, the Marlborough Blenheim, the Traymore, the Dennis, others, that had been the architectural glories of Nucky's Atlantic City were demolished one by one through the 1960s and 1970s, replaced in some cases by parking lots or vacant land. The boardwalk became seedier. The city's permanent population struggled with poverty and urban decay. Atlantic City by the mid-1970s was, in many ways, a shadow of what it had been at its Prohibition-era peak. Then, in November 1976, New Jersey voters approved a referendum allowing casino gambling in Atlantic City. The intent was to reverse the city's decline, to revitalize the economy by creating a legal gambling destination that would draw visitors back to the boardwalk. The first casino, Resorts International, opened on May 26, 1978, and the crowds that showed up were enormous. People had been waiting, quite literally, for something like this. The irony of the casino era is almost too perfect. For the entire duration of Nucky Johnson's reign, all 33 years of his tenure as county treasurer, gambling was one of the primary illegal activities that his machine protected and taxed. Casinos operated covertly. Gamblers came to Atlantic City specifically because they could gamble there without legal consequence, because the machine ensured that gambling was never genuinely prosecuted. Nucky Johnson made an enormous portion of his fortune from the gambling industry that his political protection made possible. In 1978, the state of New Jersey legalized exactly that industry, and the city that had done it illegally for decades began doing it legally. Nucky Johnson had died less than 10 years earlier. One imagines he would have found the irony both amusing and vindicating. The casino era brought billions of dollars of investment to Atlantic City and, for a period, genuine economic revitalization. But it also created new forms of the old problems: corruption, organized crime involvement in casino operations, political machines built around the new economic activity. The FBI's investigation of Atlantic City corruption in the casino era, including an extensive undercover investigation in the 1980s, produced numerous convictions of city officials and demonstrated that the culture of corruption that Nucky Johnson had built and embodied had survived him by decades. The most famous hotel of the casino era, the Taj Mahal, built by Donald Trump and opened in 1990, was itself a story of excess, debt, and eventual bankruptcy that might have amused the man who once presided over Atlantic City's golden age of excess from his suite at the Ritz-Carlton. The casino era's collapse, beginning in the 2010s as multiple Atlantic City casinos closed, mirrors in some ways the Depression-era collapse of the resort economy that had first weakened Nucky Johnson's machine. Atlantic City's capacity to generate extraordinary wealth and then lose it seems almost to be a fundamental characteristic of the place. Today, Atlantic City is a complicated, struggling, partially revived, historically rich city that carries the weight of its extraordinary past in every block of the boardwalk. Some casinos operate. The beach remains. The boardwalk, much reduced in its former grandeur, still stretches along the ocean. Tourists still come, though in different numbers and for different reasons than they did in 1925. And the ghost of Nucky Johnson is everywhere if you know where to look. In the political culture of Atlantic County, which has never fully shed the machine mentality. In the history of the buildings that were built and demolished. In the memories that residents carry of what the city once was. In the very structure of how things get done in a city where the line between legitimate and illegitimate power has always been drawn in pencil rather than ink. We have spent this entire video tracking the life and career of one man. A remarkable man, a corrupt man, a fascinating man. But the most important thing this story reveals is not about Nucky Johnson at all. It's about the system. Enoch Lewis Johnson was not an alien presence that descended on Atlantic City and corrupted a previously healthy democratic system. He was the product of that system. He emerged from within it, used its tools, operated within its rules, and exploited its genuine structural weaknesses with extraordinary skill. When he was finally removed by the federal government, not by any local democratic process, the system he had managed continued to produce corruption, just less efficiently and less elegantly organized. The political machine that Nucky built was possible because American democracy in the early 20th century had significant institutional weaknesses that machine politics exploited, weak civil service protections that made government employment patronage dependent, judicial selection processes vulnerable to political control, campaign finance systems that allowed money to flow opaquely, and law enforcement structures that were entirely local and therefore entirely vulnerable to local political capture. Many of these weaknesses have been partially addressed since Nucky's era. Civil service reforms have reduced patronage in government employment. Federal oversight of elections has grown. Judicial selection has been partially insulated from raw political pressure. Law enforcement has federal layers that cannot be controlled by local political bosses. The specific form of machine politics that Nucky Johnson mastered is significantly harder to replicate today. But the underlying dynamic, the tendency of political power to be captured by well-organized interests who then use that power to entrench themselves and generate private benefit, is not a problem that institutional reform has solved. It has changed form. It operates differently. The specific corruption of the machine era has been replaced by different forms of political corruption that are often more diffuse, more legalized, and harder to see clearly. Campaign finance arrangements that would have been familiar to Nucky Johnson in their basic logic, the trading of financial support for political protection, now operate through structures that are technically legal. The Prohibition lesson is also permanent. The attempt to solve social problems by criminalizing widespread human behavior, whether alcohol in the 1920s or other substances in subsequent decades, consistently produces the same result. Criminal organizations enriched by the gap between legal prohibition and market demand, political corruption generated by the enormous money those organizations accumulate, and social costs that exceed the benefits the prohibition was meant to produce. This lesson has been available since 1920. It has been applied imperfectly. Nucky Johnson's career also reveals something specific about the relationship between organized crime and political power. The two are not opposites. They are not in inherent conflict. They are, under certain conditions, deeply complementary, each needing what the other provides, each making the other more powerful and more durable. The political boss needs money and the freedom of operation that comes with protecting certain criminal activities. The criminal organization needs the political protection that keeps law enforcement from being effective. This relationship is not a historical curiosity. Its dynamics remain operational in various forms in various places throughout the world. The most enduring question that Nucky Johnson's story leaves us with is not, how did one man get away with this for so long? That question has a clear answer: institutional vulnerability, deliberate political cultivation, and extraordinary personal skill in managing relationships and systems. The harder question is, What does it mean that one man could do this in America in the 20th century for 30 years while everyone knew? What does it reveal about the gap between democratic ideals and democratic reality? Between the America that civics textbooks describe and the America that actually operates? Between the formal mechanisms of accountability, elections, courts, law enforcement, and the informal power structures that sometimes make those mechanisms function very differently than they're supposed to? Nucky Johnson's Atlantic City was an extreme case, a uniquely concentrated version of something that existed in less concentrated forms throughout American political life. But because it was an extreme case, it illuminates things that are harder to see when the same dynamics operate more quietly. We got rid of Nucky Johnson. The question that his story forces us to sit with is whether we ever really addressed what made him possible. History has a way of flattening people, of reducing them to their most dramatic characteristics, of making them either heroes or villains rather than the complicated, contradictory, fully human beings they actually were. Enoch Louis Johnson was not a hero. His operation caused real harm. The corruption he maintained prevented genuine democratic governance in Atlantic County for 3 decades. The machine's protection of illegal industries enabled exploitation of vulnerable people. The voter fraud that kept the machine in power disenfranchised citizens who deserved real representation. The tribute system he ran was, at its core, a vast scheme of institutionalized extortion that enriched him and his organization at the expense of everyone who had to pay. But he was also not the cartoon villain of gangster mythology. He was a man of genuine intelligence, remarkable political skill, personal warmth, and real accomplishments, measured on terms that are uncomfortable to acknowledge because they're inseparable from his corruption. He kept Atlantic City economically vital through a period when it might otherwise have declined much earlier. He maintained a social stability that, however unjust its foundations, prevented the kind of violence that characterized criminal organization in cities like Chicago and New York. He built relationships across racial lines that were, by the standards of his era, unusually sophisticated and mutually beneficial. He created a system that delivered real benefits to many of the people who participated in it, even as it generated enormous personal profit for him. He was, in the fullest sense of the phrase, an American original. A man who took the available materials, an immigrant resort town, a vulnerable democratic system, the specific opportunity of Prohibition, the particular character of New Jersey politics, and built from them something that had never existed before and has never quite existed since. He died at 85. He had been one of the most powerful men in New Jersey for 30 years. He had hosted Al Capone and Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. He had delivered elections like packages. He had built a machine so complete that it controlled every formal institution of government in an entire American county. He had gone to prison, served his time, come home, and lived out his final decades in quiet obscurity in the city he had once owned. There is something almost Shakespearean about the trajectory. The rise from humble origins, the decades of absolute power, the hubris of believing the protection would hold forever, the fall through the mechanism he had always underestimated, federal power, outside his control, the long, quiet aftermath in which the king walks among former subjects as merely a man. He never entirely lost his dignity. By all accounts, he moved through his later years with a grace that many men would have found impossible. He did not beg for relevance. He did not scheme publicly for a return to power. He accepted what had happened with the equanimity of a man who had made his bets and accepted the outcome. Perhaps he understood, as only a man of his experience could, that the outcome was always built into the bet. That the machine, however complete and however durable, was always going to end. The Atlantic City he knew is gone. The Ritz-Carlton where he lived is gone. The great hotels of the boardwalk's golden age are gone. The political machine he built is gone. The specific world that made Nucky Johnson possible, and that Nucky Johnson helped to make, has passed entirely from living memory. What remains is the story. And the story, as we have spent this entire video trying to show, is extraordinary in ways that no television dramatization has fully captured and that no simple moral about the wages of corruption can adequately contain. It is the story of an America that we have officially moved past but whose echoes we still live with. An America where the gap between democratic ideals and democratic reality was vast and visible and unashamed. An America where one man with enough skill and enough opportunity could own a city. An America that is gone, but not as gone as we like to think. We are now, in the early decades of the 21st century, living in an America that is formally very different from Nucky Johnson's America. The machines are gone, or at least quieter. Federal oversight is extensive. The civil service is more protected. Campaign finance, while imperfect, is more regulated. Law enforcement has layers of accountability that didn't exist in 1920. But consider what is still true. Money still buys political influence in America on a massive scale. Political careers still rise and fall based on access to financial support from concentrated private interests. Law enforcement priorities still reflect political considerations. Regulatory decisions still have a way of tracking the financial interests of the industries being regulated. The formal mechanisms of corruption that Nucky Johnson operated so openly have been replaced by forms that are more subtle, more legalized, and in some ways harder to see, and therefore harder to address. The Prohibition lesson has been repeatedly relearned and repeatedly ignored. The criminalization of drug possession and sale in America from the 1970s onward produced outcomes strikingly similar to alcohol prohibition. Enormous criminal organizations enriched by the gap between prohibition and demand, significant political corruption generated by that money, mass incarceration that fell most heavily on communities of color, and a continued supply of the prohibited substances to anyone who wanted them. The structural parallel to Nucky Johnson's world is not coincidental. It is the same basic dynamic operating in a different context. Atlantic City's history, the rise, the golden age, the machine era, the decline, the casino era, the further decline, is a compressed version of a story that American cities have been living in various forms throughout the country's history. The city as economic opportunity, the corruption that follows economic concentration, the reform that partially addresses the corruption, the new economic opportunity that generates new forms of corruption. The cycle does not end. It only changes character. The political machine as a phenomenon is not entirely gone. In many jurisdictions around the country, versions of the machine, less comprehensive, more legally constrained, but functionally similar in their basic logic, continue to operate. Local politics in many American cities still rewards loyalty over merit, still allocates resources based on political relationships, still maintains the informal power structures alongside the formal democratic ones that civics classes describe. The machine never fully died. It just became less visible. Nucky Johnson himself would recognize the world we live in. Not the technology, not the culture, not the specific institutions, but the underlying dynamics, the interplay of money and power and political protection, the gap between official morality and actual behavior, the tendency of formal institutions to be captured by informal power. He would recognize all of that instantly. He spent his life understanding and exploiting exactly those dynamics. The question his story poses to us is not historical. It is present tense. The questions are, how do democratic systems maintain genuine accountability over informal power structures? How do we address the gap between official rules and actual behavior without creating prohibition-style outcomes? How do we build political institutions that are genuinely responsive to the public interest rather than capturable by organized private interests? These are not questions with simple answers. They are questions that political scientists, reformers, and citizens have been working on throughout American history. Nucky Johnson's career is a case study in what happens when those questions are left unaddressed for long enough. When the machines are allowed to run long enough, when the informal power structures are allowed to become complete enough, when the gap between democratic ideals and democratic reality is allowed to grow wide enough, you get Atlantic City. You get 30 years of one man owning a city while everyone knows and no one can stop it. We look back at Nucky Johnson's era with a mixture of fascination and comfort. The comfort of believing it's past, that it couldn't happen now, that we've built better institutions, created better accountability, developed better mechanisms for democratic control. And that comfort is partly justified. Things are better in many ways. The most extreme forms of what Nucky Johnson did are harder now. But the impulse, the human, enduring impulse to use political power for private benefit, to exploit the gap between official rules and actual behavior, to build informal systems of control within and around formal democratic institutions, that impulse does not expire. It looks for the available space and fills it. Our job, if we take democratic ideals seriously, is to make that space smaller. Not to eliminate the impulse, you cannot eliminate human ambition and self-interest, but to build institutions strong enough that the available space is always shrinking, never expanding. Nucky Johnson's Atlantic City was a city where the available space was enormous, where the institutions were weak and vulnerable and easily captured, where one extraordinarily capable man could fill that space completely and hold it for 30 years. The lesson is not just about him. It's about what we build around men like him. And so we end where Nucky Johnson ended. In Atlantic City, by the ocean, in a city that still carries the memory of what it was and the hope of what it might still become. Enoch Lewis Johnson was born poor in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey in 1883. He died as a former king in the city he once owned in 1968. In between, he built one of the most remarkable and comprehensive empires of political corruption in American history. And he did it legally enough, skillfully enough, and patiently enough that it took the federal government 30 years and a tax case to bring him down. He was not the man in the television show. He was stranger than that, more human than that, more complicated than that. And his story, the real story, is darker, richer, and more important than any drama could contain. Because his story is not just the story of one man and one city. It is the story of what happens when the gap between what America says it is and what America actually is gets wide enough for a man to walk through it and build an empire in the space between. Nucky Johnson walked through that gap, and he made himself at home. If this video opened your eyes to a story you thought you knew, hit that like button right now. It genuinely matters more than you think for getting this content to people who would appreciate it. Subscribe if you're not already part of this community. Every week we do exactly this. We take real history, real people, real stories, and we go as deep as the story deserves. No filler, no repetition, no wasted time. Share this video with one person, just one. Someone who watched Boardwalk Empire and thought they understood it. Someone who loves true crime. Someone who thinks they know American history. Because after this, they'll realize the real story was always more extraordinary than the version they were given. And drop a comment right now. Tell me, what hit you hardest? Was it the 1929 conference, those men walking the boardwalk together openly while the whole country thought they were fiction? Was it the way he fell, not from violence, not from a rival, but from the IRS and a handful of men who finally decided to talk? Or was it the ending, the quiet, powerless years? A man outliving his own legend in the city that had once been entirely his? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Stay curious. Stay hungry for the real story. I'll see you in the next one.